If you love history, don't forget to like and subscribe. History does not whisper. Sometimes it screams. It screams through parades of raised arms, through shattered windows and burning books, through boots on cobblestones and names scratched off birth records. And it screams most loudly in silence. In the silence of 6 million. And in the silence that followed a single gunshot in a Berlin bunker. This is not the story of a monster born in darkness. This is the story of a boy, a painter, a soldier, a man who captured the rage of a broken nation and turned it into empire, horror, and ruin. This is the life of Adolf Hitler, told not with excuses, but with understanding. Let us begin. The River Inn flows quietly through the Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. A modest town, gentle hills, a border crossing into Germany just steps away. On April 20th, 1889, in a yellow house on Salzburger Vorstadt Street, a child was born beneath a low ceiling and a troubled sky. His name was Adolf. His father, Alois Hitler, was a stern man, authoritarian, cold, and full of pride for a name he had once taken by choice. Alois had changed his surname to Hitler years earlier, a bureaucratic tangle that would one day be the subject of scrutiny and myth. He was a customs official, disciplined, ambitious, and hard. Too hard. He ruled the household with a rod and a glare. And for little Adolf, life under that roof was no sanctuary. His mother, Clara, soft-spoken and devout, was the only warmth in the boy's world. She doted on him, protected him from the father's wrath. She called him Adi. He clung to her presence like a child to fire in winter. But Adolf was not the obedient son Alois had hoped for. He rebelled, not with fire, but with fantasy. He dreamed of architecture, of grandeur, of being someone far greater than a customs officer's boy from a provincial border town. He would stand for hours sketching buildings, cathedrals, castles. He would lose himself in the pages of Germanic history and operas of Wagner, letting his mind float toward heroic legends and Aryan ideals, even before he could name them. The family moved often, Passau, Lambach, Leonding, never quite settling. And with each move, Adolf's distance from his father grew wider. At the Benedictine monastery in Lambach, young Hitler noticed something that would stay with him forever, not in sermons, but in symbols. Over the gate of the abbey was carved an ancient icon, a swastika. To the boy, it looked timeless, powerful, a sign. He wouldn't forget it. At school, he was inconsistent. In early years, he was a capable student, sometimes even excellent. But by his teens, the spark was gone. He failed to meet expectations, and he refused to submit to instruction. His teachers saw arrogance. He saw it as vision. And then, at just 13, his father died. Alois collapsed in a tavern on the outskirts of Leonding. For some boys, such a moment would bring sadness. For Adolf, it brought release. Now, he thought, he could finally chase his dream, to become an artist. His mother, ever devoted, supported him. She scraped together what little they had to send him to Vienna, that great imperial city, a melting pot of races, languages, and empires. There he would take the entrance exam for the Academy of Fine Arts. There, he believed, destiny awaited, but Vienna was not waiting for him. He failed the entrance exam, twice. The professors found his drawings lacking life. No talent for figures. Only buildings, static, soulless. He was rejected, not once, but twice. And Vienna, cosmopolitan, diverse, brimming with Jewish intellectuals, Slavic laborers, and imperial bureaucracy, became for him not a city of dreams, but of humiliation. And as his ambition collapsed, so too did his family. In 1907, Clara Hitler, his beloved mother, died of breast cancer. Adolf, then only 18, was devastated. A Jewish doctor, Eduard Bloch, had cared for her in her final days with compassion. Hitler would later call him a noble Jew, a paradox he would never reconcile. Or perhaps he would choose not to, because grief curdled into resentment. And resentment, fueled by poverty, loneliness, and a city he could not conquer, turned to hatred. Vienna would mark him. In its slums, in its coffee houses, in the echo of languages he did not understand and faces he did not trust, the boy from Braunau became something else. A drifter. A nobody. But in his mind he was not defeated. He was waiting. In the soup kitchens and flop houses of the Austro-Hungarian capital, Hitler began absorbing the politics of race, nationalism, and conspiracy. He read, voraciously, pamphlets, newspapers, pseudo-scientific tracts on race, works by men like Karl Lueger, Vienna's mayor and proud anti-Semite, who taught him how populism could mask prejudice with polish. By 1913, with no money, no education, and no future in Vienna, Hitler crossed the border into Munich, Germany. The land he had always felt was truly his, a place where his name might one day mean something. A storm was coming, and the boy was almost ready to meet it. Munich, 1913. The street smelled of coal and revolution. Cafes buzzed with talk of war and empire, of socialism and nationhood. For Adolf Hitler, now 24 years old and barely scraping by, this was not just a city. It was a stage. Here, he thought, he could start again. No more Vienna. No more rejection. No more shame. But Munich offered no instant salvation. He lived in cheap boarding houses, painting postcards and advertisements to survive. Sometimes, he sold watercolors to tourists, charming cityscapes, always neat, always cold. Art remained his dream, but the dream had grown pale and brittle. What he had once imagined as glory now seemed like survival. He was angry, but not yet focused, not until war. August 1914. The world held its breath as Europe tore itself apart. Archdukes had fallen, treaties had triggered, Germany declared war. And Adolf Hitler found his purpose. He had once been a stateless vagabond. Now he was a German soldier. He enlisted with joy, writing to the Bavarian king to plead for a chance to serve. And when he was accepted into the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, he wore the uniform with pride. Finally, he belonged to something greater than himself. And on October 29th, 1914, he marched into Belgium with the others, eyes wide, jaw tight, pack heavy. He carried no rifle, only a message pouch and a hunger for greatness. The trenches were not glory, they were horror. Mud, lice, rats the size of cats, the smell of death, the moan of the wounded left too long in no man's land. But Hitler adapted. He was quiet, distant, not a leader, not a friend, but he was brave. He served as a runner, sprinting between command posts under fire, carrying orders through gas and shell fire. He was wounded once, temporarily blinded by mustard gas another time. He was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, and then later, the rare first class, for bravery. His superiors called him reliable. His comrades called him strange. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't chase girls or crack jokes in the dugouts. He read books on German history, nationalism, and architecture. He spoke with authority about culture and race, and he hated. He hated Marxists. He hated Jews. He hated the generals he believed were betraying the front from cushy offices. He hated the press, the pacifists, the poets. He began to see Germany not as a country, but as an idea under attack. And he would be its sword. Then came 1918. Germany surrendered. The Kaiser abdicated. Revolutions swept through Berlin. Red flags flew. Workers seized factories. To many, it was the birth of democracy. To Hitler, it was treason. He was in a field hospital when the news came. Still blinded from a gas attack, he wept in the infirmary, fists clenched, eyes still burning. He would later describe it as the worst day of his life. He had believed in Germany's victory with religious fervor. And now, in the shame of defeat, something inside him calcified. Back in Munich, the post-war years were chaos. The Weimar Republic was born in blood and protest. Communists and Freikorps fought in the streets. Money lost its meaning. Inflation surged. And old soldiers, unemployed and adrift, wandered the cities searching for someone to blame. So did Hitler. He stayed in the army, not as a soldier, but as a spy. His job, infiltrate political groups and report on subversive activity. One day, he was assigned to attend a small gathering of fringe nationalists, the German Workers' Party. He sat quietly in the back, listened, then stood to speak. And something happened. The room stilled, eyes turned. He spoke not like a soldier or an artist. He spoke like fire. He raged against the Treaty of Versailles, against Marxists, against Jews, against the traitors who had stabbed Germany in the back. His voice rose and fell like music. He gestured with urgency. He trembled with conviction. And the room applauded. Within weeks, he was not spying on the party. He was leading it. He joined the German Workers' Party in 1919 and quickly became its star speaker. By 1920, he helped rename it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. They were small, a handful of radicals meeting in beer halls. But Hitler gave them something they lacked: a voice and a vision. He crafted symbols, the swastika, bold, ancient, eye-catching. He organized rallies, parades, dramatic speeches with banners and music. He studied crowd psychology, understood the power of spectacle, and most of all, he gave the people a villain. The Jew, he declared, is the parasite poisoning the blood of the nation. It was hatred wrapped in oratory, and it worked. In these early years, Hitler met men who would become central to his rise. Ernst Röhm, the muscle; Rudolf Hess, the loyalist; Hermann Göring, the decorated pilot; and Heinrich Himmler, who would later shape the SS into a machine of death. They were misfits, fanatics, veterans, and in Hitler, they found a prophet. The dream had returned, but it was no longer of art or architecture. It was a dream of power, total power. And in the shadows of Munich's shattered streets, Adolf Hitler began building a new identity. No longer the rejected artist, now a leader. November 8, 1923, Munich. Inside the Bürgerbräukeller, a vast beer hall filled with smoke, noise, and veterans still hungry for meaning, Adolf Hitler stood on a table. His hand gripped a pistol. His eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the crowd. The time for speeches was over. He fired one shot into the air and shouted, "The national revolution has begun." This was no longer just a movement. It was an attempted coup. The Beer Hall Putsch, as it would come to be known, was Hitler's first violent bid for power. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he believed he could march from Munich to Berlin, sweeping aside the Weimar government in a wave of nationalist fervor. He had the Sturmabteilung, the SA, behind him. The brown shirts, a paramilitary mob fueled by rage and beer, ready to fight and bleed for the cause. And on that cold night, with speeches raging and generals coerced at gunpoint, it seemed, for a moment, as if destiny was moving. But by morning, the illusion shattered. The coup collapsed in the streets. Police opened fire on the marchers at the Odeonsplatz. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler fell to the ground as shots rang out, dislocating his shoulder. His comrade Göring was badly wounded. The revolution was over before it began. And Hitler? He was arrested for treason. Yet the prison bars did not close the book on his ambition. They opened it. At Landsberg prison, in a comfortable cell adorned with books and flowers, Hitler was treated more like a celebrity than a convict. Guards greeted him with respect. Visitors came freely. Donations poured in. He spent his days dictating thoughts to his loyal follower, Rudolf Hess. The result? A manifesto. A declaration of belief. A roadmap to terror. It was called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Inside its pages, Hitler mixed autobiography with venom. He described his youth, his hatred of Jews, his belief in the superiority of the Aryan race, and his vision for a greater Germany, one that would expand eastward, annihilate Bolshevism, and cleanse itself of undesirable elements. He wrote with the fire of a man who believed in fate, not just his own, but that of an entire people. The book sold poorly at first. Critics mocked it, intellectuals ignored it, but among the desperate and the bitter, it found a home. And for Hitler, prison was not defeat. It was transformation. When he emerged in 1924, less than a year later, he was no longer a failed revolutionary. He was a martyr. The Nazis had been banned after the putsch, but Hitler used his newfound fame to rebuild legally. He promised to avoid violence, publicly at least, and began reshaping the Nazi Party into a proper political machine. It was slow going at first. The German economy had stabilized. The Weimar Republic was fragile but standing. The public was tired of extremism. For a time, Hitler faded into the background, but he was watching, waiting. Then came 1929, the Great Depression. The global economy crumbled, and with it, the Weimar dream. Factories closed, families starved, banks collapsed. And once again, Germans looked for someone to blame. Hitler gave them a list. The Jews, the Marxists, the international bankers, the November criminals who had signed the Treaty of Versailles. He didn't speak with nuance. He didn't offer policy. He offered blame and fire. The Nazi Party surged. They gained seats in the Reichstag. Their rallies grew. Their banners, red, black, and white, filled the streets like a rising tide. Goebbels, the master propagandist, crafted speeches, films, posters, all designed to make Hitler seem like Germany's last hope. And he believed it. He began to cultivate a persona, not just of a politician, but of a savior. He posed for portraits staring into the distance, the light catching his eyes like a prophet in a storm. He spoke of Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community, unified in race and purpose. He promised to restore pride, to punish the enemies of Germany, to resurrect the empire that had been lost. And crowds listened. Tens of thousands gathered to hear him speak. Not in debate halls, but in arenas. He didn't argue. He declared. The SA patrolled the streets, attacking dissenters, breaking up rival meetings, intimidating Jews and leftists. Violence returned, but cloaked in patriotism. And the Nazi Party became more than a fringe. It became a movement. In 1932, Hitler ran for president against aging war hero Paul von Hindenburg. He lost. But with over 13 million votes, he proved his popularity and his power. Hindenburg, old and weary, called him that bohemian corporal. But the Reichstag was fractured. No party could govern. Chaos loomed. And behind closed doors, conservative elites plotted. They believed they could use Hitler, control him, tame the beast. On January 30th, 1933, they handed him the key. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The painter, the private, the prisoner, was now the most powerful man in Germany. He had not marched on Berlin with guns. He had walked in through the front door. Berlin, 1933. Snow dusted the Brandenburg Gate. The city was quiet, uncertain, caught between fear and fragile hope. In the Reichstag, torches flickered in the cold. Outside, the streets simmered with marching boots and rising voices. Germany, fractured and humiliated, had placed its future in the hands of a man it barely understood. Adolf Hitler was chancellor, but he wanted more. He didn't just want to lead the government. He wanted to become the government. The first move came quickly. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building went up in flames. The cause? Arson. A Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene. Hitler and his allies pointed to the fire as proof. The communists are plotting revolution. It didn't matter whether it was true. It worked. The next morning, the Reichstag fire decree was signed by President Hindenburg. It suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, privacy. Police could arrest without warrant. Newspapers could be shut down. Political enemies could be jailed. Overnight, Germany's fragile democracy was placed under lock and key. And Hitler held the key. Within weeks, over 4,000 political opponents were imprisoned. Socialists, communists, liberals. The brown shirts swarmed the streets, brutalizing critics. Newspapers were silenced. Radios blared a single voice, the Nazi voice. But it wasn't enough. In March 1933, Hitler introduced the Enabling Act to the new Reichstag, now stripped of dissent. The act gave him full legislative power, bypassing parliament. He needed a 2/3 majority to pass it, so he lied. He promised stability. He promised religious freedom. He promised to protect the Reich from enemies within. Intimidated, manipulated, and in some cases outright bribed, the vote passed. Germany was no longer a republic. It was a dictatorship. And Hitler, the man who once begged to enlist in a foreign army, was now Führer of a nation. With absolute power, Hitler moved quickly. Trade unions were dismantled. Independent courts were dissolved. Opposition parties were outlawed. All authority flowed to one man, and all dissent was painted as treason. The Nazi flag now flew beside the Black Eagle of Germany. The two had become one. And then the camps began. The first, Dachau, was established in March 1933. At first, it was for political prisoners. But over time, its gates would swing wide to hold Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and above all, Jews. The message was clear. There was no place in Hitler's Germany for difference. But terror was only one side of his rule. The other was seduction. Hitler understood the power of myth. He presented himself not just as a ruler, but as a redeemer. Through mass rallies in Nuremberg, perfectly choreographed by Goebbels and Leni Riefenstahl's cinematic propaganda, he created a visual language of glory. Swastikas waved like flames. Banners rippled in the wind. The people chanted in unison, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one leader. He revitalized national pride. Public works were launched. Highways, Autobahnen, stretched across the country. Factories reopened. Unemployment dropped. The Volkswagen, the people's car, was promised to every household. To many, life was improving. And when life improves, people look away from the cost. But beneath the surface, the price was already being paid. The Gestapo, Nazi secret police, monitored homes, schools, churches. Children were recruited into the Hitler Youth. Books were burned in the town squares, their flames lighting the night sky with censorship. A single narrative was allowed, and that narrative placed the Jew at the center of every evil. Hitler didn't invent anti-Semitism. It had festered in Europe for centuries. But he industrialized it. With speeches, posters, films, and laws, he made the Jew not just a scapegoat, but an enemy of the state. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of citizenship. They could not marry Aryans. They could not serve in government. They could not vote. They became ghosts in their own country. And the world watched and did nothing. By now, Hitler's reach extended to every institution: education, media, military. But some resistance remained, even within his own party. The SA, Hitler's original paramilitary force under Ernst Röhm, had grown too powerful, too bold. Röhm wanted a second revolution, one that would replace the army with the SA and push socialism to the forefront. Hitler refused. He needed the army. In June 1934, he made his decision. It was called the Night of the Long Knives. Over 3 days, Hitler ordered the SS to execute Röhm and dozens of others, old allies, critics, rivals. The message was brutal and effective. Loyalty was not enough. Obedience was required. The army, grateful to see Röhm gone, swore allegiance, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler personally. The oath was chilling. I swear to obey the Führer of the German Reich and people Adolf Hitler with loyalty and bravery. I vowed to him and to him alone. Then on August 2, 1934, President Hindenburg died. There would be no replacement. Hitler merged the roles of Chancellor and President. He was now supreme leader, Führer of the German Reich. No more parliaments, no more shared power, just one man and a nation ready to follow. By 1905, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of domestic power. The opposition was crushed. The press was silent. The people, terrified, mesmerized, or both, chanted his name in stadiums and whispered it in fear at night. But he was not content with control. He wanted conquest. In Mein Kampf, Hitler had laid out a vision, wild, expansive, terrifying. A vision the world had dismissed as the rantings of a fanatic. But now, the fanatic had an army, a nation, a cause, and above all, a grievance. The Treaty of Versailles. Signed in 1919, the treaty had dismembered Germany. Its army was crippled, its borders shrunk, its pride humiliated. To Hitler, this was not just a treaty. It was a dagger. And now, he would pull it out. First, he rearmed. In secret at first, then in the open. Factories buzzed with the manufacture of tanks, planes, rifles. The Wehrmacht was reborn. The Luftwaffe took to the skies. Young men once unemployed were now marching in formation, singing of blood and soil. In 1935, conscription was reintroduced. The world protested, mildly, but nothing more. Then came 1936. German troops entered the Rhineland, territory that had been demilitarized by the treaty. It was a bold gamble. If France had intervened, the Wehrmacht would have had to retreat. But France did nothing. Nor did Britain. And Hitler learned the first great truth of his foreign policy. The world was afraid. Inside Germany, his popularity surged. He presented himself not as a warlord, but a restorer. A man correcting the injustices of Versailles, one bold move at a time. His next target, unity. Austria, his birthplace and a sovereign nation, had a strong Nazi following. Hitler encouraged agitation, propaganda, chaos. In 1938, under pressure and threat of invasion, Austria's chancellor resigned. German troops rolled in unopposed. The Anschluss, the unification of Austria and Germany, was complete, and the people, many of them cheered. In Vienna, Jews were forced to scrub streets with toothbrushes. In Berlin, crowds filled the streets. 1,000 arms raised in salute. Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer, one empire, one people, one leader. But Hitler's hunger had not been sated. He turned next to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, home to ethnic Germans. He claimed they were oppressed, threatened, abused. It was a familiar script. He made demands. Britain and France hesitated. War loomed. Then came the Munich Agreement. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany. He believed he could preserve peace. He gave Hitler the Sudetenland, without Czechoslovakia's consent, in exchange for a promise, no more territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to London with the words, "Peace for our time." Hitler laughed. In March 1909, he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. No justification, no pretext, just power. The illusion of diplomacy was shattered, and the world finally realized what Germany had become. But even as Europe reeled, Hitler looked eastward, toward Poland. It was more than land. It was ideology. To Hitler, Poland stood in the way of his true goal, Lebensraum, living space, a racial empire stretching into the east, built on the ashes of Slavs and Jews. He made demands on Poland. They refused. The world braced for war. But first, a shock. On August 23, 1939, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with his ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stunned the globe. Secretly, the two dictators agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be the first to fall. On September 1, 1939, German tanks crossed the Polish border. Air raids lit up Warsaw. Civilians fled in panic. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. And on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. In Berlin, Hitler was exultant. He believed it would be fast, brutal, triumphant. In truth, it would become something else. The war he had longed for would become a furnace that burned the world and consumed him in the flames. But for now, Hitler basked in victory. By the summer of 1940, Poland had fallen. Then Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands. France surrendered in June. Paris fell. German officers marched beneath the Eiffel Tower. Hitler visited the city at dawn, staying just long enough to pose for photographs, then departing with quiet satisfaction. He had avenged Versailles. He had humbled Europe, and he believed the future belonged to him. But even as he plotted further conquest of Britain, of Russia, Hitler began another war. A secret war. Not of soldiers and tanks, but of trains and names and smoke. 1940. Berlin. A city cloaked in banners and iron. Statues of eagles loomed over public squares. Swastikas flapped in rhythm with marching drums. The crowd still cheered. But beneath the surface, the storm that Hitler had summoned was gathering force beyond his control. The Reich was at its zenith, but it was also teetering on the edge. In just over a year, Hitler had accomplished what no German leader before him could. He had unified the people, crushed dissent, built an economy of war, and expanded the borders of the Reich from the Rhine to the Seine. He was a master of spectacle. But now, spectacle alone was not enough. To hold the empire he had conjured from fire, he would need something else. Total obedience, total surveillance, total fear. His inner circle, once a band of radicals and veterans, had become a state within a state. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of terror, expanded the SS into a vast apparatus of control, spanning police, intelligence, and the growing network of concentration camps. Joseph Goebbels, the master of illusion, turned propaganda into religion. Hermann Göring, swollen with vanity, ran the Luftwaffe and enriched himself from confiscated Jewish property. Rudolf Hess remained devoted. Albert Speer rose as the good Nazi, building monuments of concrete and myth. Each man owed everything to Hitler, and each man feared him. But even among such shadows, Hitler's own vision was growing more fevered. He spoke often of destiny, of fate. He believed Germany was locked in an existential struggle, not just for land, but for blood. The enemy, in his mind, was not just political. It was racial. And so, while the Wehrmacht conquered lands, the SS prepared for something else. Something darker. Ghettos were established in Poland, sealed neighborhoods where Jews were confined like cattle. Starvation, disease, curfews, identity badges, deportations. In 1941, the first mass shootings of Jews began in the forests of Eastern Europe. Entire villages were marched into the woods, forced to strip, shot into pits. Hitler never signed an order explicitly authorizing genocide. But he didn't need to. His words had made it inevitable. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, Hitler had turned his eyes to Britain. The island nation refused to yield. Under Winston Churchill, the British stood alone, defiant. So Hitler launched the Blitz, a relentless bombing campaign meant to shatter morale and force surrender. It failed. Instead of breaking Britain, it hardened it. Hitler had underestimated his enemy, and worse, he was about to repeat the same mistake, on a catastrophic scale. On June 26, 1941, without warning, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers stormed into the Soviet Union. They moved with fury, driven not only by conquest, but by ideology. This was not just a war for territory, it was a war of annihilation. The Slavs were subhuman, Hitler declared. Bolshevism was Jewish. The East must be cleansed. It was, in his words, a war of extermination. And so it began. Villages were burned, commissars executed, entire populations displaced or murdered. The Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads, followed behind the front lines, systematically killing Jews, Roma, and political opponents. Mass graves became common as forests filled with corpses. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Moscow did not fall. The Russian winter arrived. German supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers froze in trenches dug through permafrost. The myth of Nazi invincibility cracked. Still, Hitler refused to retreat. He demanded his generals hold ground at all costs. He dismissed advice, overruled strategy, and believed his will alone could shape reality. He was no longer simply commanding a war. He was trying to will history itself into submission. At home, dissent became even more dangerous. Even a whisper of disloyalty could mean imprisonment, or worse. Children were taught to report on parents. Neighbors vanished overnight. The Gestapo, unseen and omnipresent, ensured that fear lived in every household. But not all Germans remained silent. In Munich, a group of students formed a resistance movement called the White Rose. Led by siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, they distributed leaflets condemning the regime, calling for moral awakening. They were caught, beheaded in a prison courtyard. Their final words, "Long live freedom." Hitler barely noticed. He was too consumed by his own myth. He no longer tolerated generals who questioned him. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch was dismissed. Others were demoted or transferred. Hitler began micromanaging battles, obsessed with maps, shifting divisions like a child rearranging toy soldiers. He moved into the Wolf's Lair, a fortified bunker in East Prussia. There, isolated, surrounded by sycophants, Hitler began to drift further into delusion. His health declined. His hands trembled, his speech slurred. He developed a hunched gait. He consumed bizarre medicines, eye drops of cocaine, injections of animal hormones. His personal doctor, Theodor Morell, became a constant presence, feeding him potions and praise. The once fiery orator was becoming a frail shadow, but his will remained iron. In early 1942, a conference was held in a quiet villa on the outskirts of Berlin. 15 men gathered for lunch. They drank wine. They discussed logistics, trains, schedules, numbers. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed on a new phase, the final solution, the plan to exterminate every Jew in Europe. The camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, would become factories of death. The Holocaust had begun in blood. Now it would continue in ash. It was the summer of 1942. The banner still flew. The radios still broadcast his voice. The children still saluted. But deep within the Reich, something was shifting. Adolf Hitler, once the ascending force, was now orbiting the height of his power, and gravity was preparing to pull him down. The empire he had carved into Europe was vast. From the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Stalingrad, the Nazi flag waved. But this dominion was built on blood and illusion, and both were running thin. In Berlin, the streets were quiet by night, blacked out, shuttered, filled with whispers. Families waited for letters that wouldn't come. Bombs had not yet fallen on the capital, but fear already had. Still, Hitler pressed forward. He believed in the tide of fate, and he saw it cresting in the east. Stalingrad, a name he would turn into obsession. A city on the Volga, unremarkable in peace but critical in war. To Hitler, its fall would be a symbol, a dagger in Stalin's heart, a monument to German supremacy. And so he ordered the Sixth Army to take it. The battle began in the summer of 1942. It would last 6 months. Urban warfare like nothing before. House to house, room to room. Snipers hid in shadows. Flamethrowers scorched stairwells. Artillery rained ceaselessly. The Volga ran red, and in the dead of winter, the trap closed. The Soviets encircled Stalingrad. Over 300,000 German troops were caught. Field Marshal Paulus requested permission to retreat. Hitler refused. Not one step back, he ordered. He believed the will of a leader could bend reality, but reality had teeth. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered. 250,000 men lost. It was the turning point of the war. For the first time, the myth of Hitler's invincibility cracked. At home, the mood shifted. Goebbels responded with his infamous total war speech at the Berlin Sportpalast. "Do you want total war?" he screamed to a whipped-up crowd. The answer was yes, but the cost would be immeasurable. By now, Hitler's leadership style had hardened into ritual. He rarely left his bunker. Maps covered the walls. He would pore over them for hours, commanding divisions that no longer existed, dreaming of counterattacks that would never come. He trusted no one. Not his generals, not his ministers, not even his oldest allies. The SS became his sword, the Gestapo his ears, and the camps, his silence. Jews from across Europe were rounded up, deported from ghettos, trains packed to suffocation, arrivals sorted by finger-pointing officers. Children, mothers, elderly. Names became numbers. At Auschwitz, the chimneys burned day and night. And yet, Hitler spoke little of it publicly. He had learned that the machinery of horror did not need speeches. It needed orders, logistics, and the quiet compliance of millions. The Holocaust was not a secret, but it was hidden behind euphemism. Resettlement, evacuation, special treatment. Each word was a mask. By 1944, the tide was turning rapidly. The Allies had landed in Italy, then in France. The Atlantic Wall cracked under the weight of D-Day. Normandy became a beachhead, and from there, liberation moved eastward. The Red Army pushed west, retaking cities Hitler had once celebrated as trophies. The two fronts were closing in. Inside the Reich, fear metastasized into betrayal. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters. They planted a bomb beneath a heavy oak table. It exploded. 4 men were killed, but Hitler survived. His hair was singed, his eardrums ruptured, his trousers shredded, but he emerged from the smoke not humbled, but enraged. He saw it as divine proof of his destiny. "I am immortal," he declared. The purge that followed was merciless. Thousands were arrested. Over 200 conspirators were executed, some slowly, filmed for Hitler's pleasure. Even men who had served him for decades were not spared. The Führer's paranoia reached its zenith, and so did his isolation. By the end of 1944, Germany was dying. Cities lay in ruins. Oil was gone. Trains no longer ran. Food was scarce. Civilians dug trenches with bare hands. Air raids came daily. Children fought in uniform. The country had become a mausoleum in waiting. But Hitler refused surrender. He still dreamed of miracle weapons, of secret jets, of vengeance. He launched the Ardennes offensive, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. It was a final gamble, and it failed. The Allies closed in from the west, the Soviets from the east. Germany was collapsing. And in the center of it all, in a bunker beneath the burning capital, the Führer still dreamed of a Reich that would last 1,000 years, and of enemies he would never face again. By the start of 1905, the Third Reich was a rotting corpse, still moving, still killing, but already dead in spirit. Its borders shrank by the day. Its cities were cemeteries. And in the heart of it all, Adolf Hitler, once the furious voice of a nation, was now a gaunt figure in a concrete tomb. But the war he had ignited raged on. Europe was burning. From the snow-choked ruins of the Eastern Front to the shattered streets of Rotterdam, Warsaw, and London, Hitler's war had touched every life. More than 60 million souls would die before it ended. And yet, even as death piled higher than empire, Hitler refused surrender. He still believed in fate, in vengeance, in himself. Inside the Führer bunker, beneath the ruins of Berlin, the lights flickered. Maps curled at the edges. Reports came in hourly, each worse than the last. Cities lost. Allies defecting. Soviet shells getting closer. And Hitler? He shuffled through corridors, stooped and trembling, eyes bloodshot, his voice growing weaker with every passing hour. His doctors fed him sedatives, stimulants, and strange injections. But no medicine could cure the disease he had become. Above ground, Berlin braced for the end. Women dug trenches. Boys of the Hitler Youth manned machine guns. The once proud capital of the Reich was now a city of ghosts. Its monuments crumbling, its people starving, its sky blackened by ash and smoke. The world Hitler had sworn to dominate had turned against him. The United States, after years of isolation, now bombed his factories and cities by day and night. Britain never yielded, its defiance embodied in Churchill's words and the roar of Spitfires. And the Soviet Union, the very people he had called subhuman, now marched across Eastern Europe like a wrathful tide. The Allies had already liberated France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Greece. And with each step, they uncovered horror. Camps, cattle cars, mass graves. Auschwitz was found by the Soviets in January 1945. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. Skeletons walked. Mountains of shoes, piles of hair, mounds of ash. The Holocaust was no longer a secret. It was a scar. Open, bleeding, undeniable. But still, the war raged. Germany had become a fortress of denial. Its people, once mesmerized by pageantry, now huddled in basements. Yet Hitler demanded more blood, more resistance, more death. He ordered scorched earth policies, burning bridges, mines, farms. If Germany was to fall, he declared, it should take the world with it. His generals disagreed. Field marshals like Model and Kesselring knew the truth, but they dared not speak it. To question the Führer was to risk execution or disgrace. Even those who once sat at his side now plotted escape or distanced themselves. Goering tried to assume leadership in the chaos. Himmler sought to negotiate secretly with the Allies. Hitler, furious, called them traitors. He cut them off. In his final days, Hitler dictated a last testament. A rambling, bitter screed blaming the Jews, the Allies, and his own people for the fall of his vision. There was no reflection, no remorse, only a desire that history remember him as unbroken. Outside, Soviet artillery pummeled Berlin day and night. The Red Army closed in block by block. Apartment buildings became bunkers. Rivers became battlefields. The smell of gunpowder and rot hung in the air. Women were raped. Civilians executed. There were no innocents left, only survivors. In the bunker, Hitler prepared for the end. He had married Eva Braun the night before. She had been by his side for years, unacknowledged in public but unwavering in private. Their wedding was brief, hollow, and final. The next morning, April 30th, 1945, he said goodbye to his staff. He retreated to his private chamber with Eva. 2 shots rang out. When the guards entered, they found him slumped on a couch, a pistol in his hand, a bullet through his temple. Eva lay beside him. She had taken cyanide. Their bodies were burned in the courtyard per his orders. Not even ash was left to bury. The war continued for days, but the heart of the Reich had stopped beating. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945. In London, bells rang. In Paris, tears fell. In New York, strangers embraced. In Moscow, soldiers raised their flags over the ruins of Berlin. The nightmare had ended, but the world would never be the same. They called it a solution, but it was nothing less than mechanized murder, systematic, industrial, and cold. The final solution. Those words would come to define the darkest chapter of Adolf Hitler's legacy. A plan not for war, but for erasure. Not for victory, but annihilation. And at its core was a belief so monstrous, it required a nation to look away while it was carried out. The seeds were sown long before war began. Hitler had written them into Mein Kampf, the myth of the Jewish threat, the fantasy of Aryan purity, the delusion that Germany's fall had been engineered by invisible hands. For years, his propaganda machine dehumanized Jews. Cartoons, newspapers, films, laws. Step by step, life narrowed for them. No citizenship, no jobs, no marriage, no voice, and then no place. With the invasion of Poland in 1939, Nazi policy shifted from persecution to isolation. Ghettos were created, sealed off neighborhoods in cities like Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow. Barbed wire, armed guards, starvation rations, overcrowding, entire families crammed into single rooms. Children grew up never seeing beyond the wall. Disease ran rampant. Bodies lay in the streets. But the suffering was not an accident. It was a test. The real plan came later, quietly discussed, bureaucratically organized. On January 20th, 1942, 15 high-ranking Nazis gathered at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee near Berlin. They drank cognac, ate pastries, and signed a plan for murder. The final solution to the Jewish question. The goal? The complete extermination of every Jew in Europe. 11 million people. Mass shootings had already begun in the east. The Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht through Russia, Lithuania, Ukraine. Men were lined up on the edge of pits. Women held their children. Bullets were expensive, so they fired in layers. Afterward, the earth was shoveled back over the bodies. Sometimes the ground moved. But even this horror was seen as inefficient. It traumatized the shooters. It left evidence. So the Nazis sought better methods. And thus, the camps. At first, they were for imprisonment, Dachau, Sachsenhausen. But in time, new camps were built with a single purpose: death. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. Remote, isolated, engineered. Trains brought victims by the thousands. Deportation orders disguised as resettlement. Families packed into cattle cars for days, no food, no water, no air. When the doors opened, the process was fast. A selection. Left, forced labor. Right, death. Children, mothers, the elderly, they were led to showers. Rooms disguised with signs. Hooks on the walls. Bars of soap. Then, the doors locked. And Zyklon B was released. Screams. Scratching. Silence. Afterward, gold teeth were removed, hair shaved, bodies incinerated, ashes scattered or buried in mass graves. The process was repeated. Hour after hour, day after day. At Auschwitz alone, over 1 million people died. But it wasn't just Jews. Roma and Sinti, political dissidents, disabled people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet POWs, all fed into the same machine. And behind it all, paperwork, train schedules, gas orders, daily quotas. The Holocaust was not chaotic. It was organized. And Hitler? He never visited a camp, but he knew. He approved. His speeches were filled with euphemism, elimination, cleansing, removal. But those who listened closely understood. His hatred was no longer metaphor. It had become policy. By 1944, the world began to hear whispers. Escaped prisoners told stories of gas chambers and crematoria. The Allies intercepted coded messages. Photos were smuggled out. But disbelief was common. Surely, it couldn't be true. Not on this scale. And so the killing continued. It wasn't until the Allies reached the camps that the truth was undeniable. In April 1945, American soldiers liberated Buchenwald, then Dachau, then Mauthausen, then Bergen-Belsen. What they found defied language. Mountains of corpses, walking skeletons, bunkers filled with shoes, glasses, hair, and survivors, if they could be called that, staring out with hollow eyes. General Eisenhower ordered the horrors be documented. He made journalists and politicians visit. He said, "Let the world see what we have seen, because someday someone will say it never happened." After the war at Nuremberg, the Nazi leadership stood trial. Some claimed they didn't know. Others claimed they were following orders. But the evidence spoke louder. Photos, documents, eyewitnesses, and in the end, justice came, however incomplete. Some were hanged, others imprisoned, many escaped. Some disappeared. But the world had seen the abyss, and Adolf Hitler, though dead, was its architect. The final solution was not a sudden decision. It was a progression of rhetoric, laws, silence, and complicity. And it remains, to this day, the ultimate warning of what hate, unchecked, can become. April 1940, the Third Reich, once envisioned as eternal, was now a smoldering ruin. Cities lay in rubble, railroads twisted like bones. The smell of smoke and rot filled the spring air, and in the heart of Berlin, beneath the wreckage of a fallen empire, Adolf Hitler prepared to die. His world had shrunk to a bunker, the Führerbunker, 8 meters underground, dimly lit, damp and humming with the sound of collapse. Maps still hung on the walls, but the front lines no longer mattered. They were gone. Like the armies, like the faith. All that remained was paranoia, delusion, and decay. He was no longer the fiery orator of Nuremberg, no longer the steely-eyed commander at parade. The man now pacing the corridors was pale, stooped, trembling. His left hand shook constantly, his right foot dragged, his eyes were sunken, his temper volcanic. He screamed at generals who no longer existed, moved troops that had already died, and plotted counterattacks with divisions that were only ink on paper. The city above was dying. Artillery pounded Berlin day and night. The Soviets were only blocks away. Every hour brought them closer. Civilians fled or hid. Women wept in basements. Children were handed grenades. The subway stations became tombs. Gas stations exploded into fireballs. There was no more resistance, only fear. And inside the bunker, Hitler dictated his final words. He blamed the Jews, the generals, the German people. He spoke of betrayal, of cowardice, of a world unworthy of him. "I never wanted this war," he insisted. But the lies had stopped working, even on himself. On April 28th, he learned that Heinrich Himmler, his old disciple, his SS chief, had tried to negotiate peace with the Allies. It broke him. He raged, foamed at the mouth, tore off his medals. There were no loyal men left. Not Göring, not Himmler, not even his country. On April 29th, in the gloom of the bunker, he married Eva Braun. She had waited years for the honor. She wore a black dress. Their witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. It was a funeral disguised as a wedding. That same night, Hitler wrote his will. He left nothing to the nation. No successor. No hope. Only final instructions. Burn the bodies. Let nothing remain. The next day, April 30th, 1945, midday, he and Eva took their final meal. A modest lunch. Afterward, they retreated to his private room. He bit down on a cyanide capsule and pulled the trigger of a Walther PPK. Eva used only poison. When his aides entered, they found them side by side. The Führer's skull shattered, blood dripping from the sofa. Eva, motionless, her mouth blue. The reign of Adolf Hitler had ended not with a speech, but with silence. Outside, under shell fire, their bodies were doused in petrol and set alight in the garden. Smoke rose into the gray sky as Berlin crumbled around them. By May 2nd, the city surrendered. By May 8th, the war in Europe was over. And the man who had vowed to rule the world now existed only in ruin and memory. But his legacy did not die with him. The scars remained. In the numbers tattooed on the arms of survivors. In the ruins of cities bombed into dust. In the names carved into memorial walls. His crimes, though countless, were not nameless, and history would never look away again. So what remains? A man who rose from poverty to ultimate power. A man who seduced a nation, conquered a continent, and destroyed millions. A painter turned tyrant. A voice turned fire. A myth turned nightmare. Adolf Hitler fell, but the warning he left behind rises anew with every generation, because history is not a straight line, and evil wears many faces. We remember not to glorify, but to guard against the silence. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, taught you, or made you reflect, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. History must not be forgotten, and voices lost to time must never go unheard again. Until next time, rest well and remember.